we start? Is everyone ready? Okay. So, welcome ladies and gentlemen. The motion for today's debate is this House supports France's exit from West Africa. Representing the proposition, we have the team from Thailand, and on the opposition, we have team from Australia. From the proposition side, our speakers are first speaker Girat, second speaker Torfan, third speaker Pim, reply speaker Torfan. On the opposition side, our speakers are first speaker Will, second speaker Michael, third speaker Jenny, and the reply speaker Michael. Each speaker will have 8 minutes to deliver their speech. The first and the last minute of each speech is considered protected time during which points of information, POIs, may not be offered. The judges will signal the end of protected time at the 1 minute mark, after which POIs can be offered, and will signal the return to the protected time at the 7 minute mark. At the 8 minute mark, they will give a double clap or ding to signal the end of the speech. Additionally, there will be 3 claps or dings at 8:15, and the judges will stop listening at 8:30. Best of luck to both teams, and I hand over the floor to our chair judge. Good luck.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. Hi everyone, my name is Shimon. First of all, in this round, I go by he pronouns, but please refer to the panel as a whole throughout your speeches. Before we do anything else, I would like to ask my panelists to introduce themselves. This is Anna from the left.
Hello, I'm Laura. I'm from Slovenia. She can call me as my last name. I wish both teams a lot of luck.
Hello, my name is Francisco. I come from Argentina. I go by he and him. Best of luck to both teams.
Thank you very much. I will be keeping track of time for you, giving noise signals like this at the end of the protected time towards the beginning of the speech, and then again to signalize that the protected time has started again at the 7th minute mark. I will also special this twice like this to signalize the 8 minute mark, but please keep track of time yourselves so that you don't run too much overtime and so that you can strategically allocate content throughout the speech. Before we begin, is there anything you would like to ask or a concern you would like to raise? Okay, if not, then everyone is okay. Then I would like to ask the first proposition speaker to deliver their speech. Here.
The French promise after decolonization in the 1960s was that West African states would develop with the support of France and be militarily protected. But in 2024, West African states like Chad and Niger are the poorest states in the region. Operation Barkhane was a decade-long failure that never dealt with the terrorists that now threaten the region, and anti-French sentiment has led to 3 out of 8 West African states forcing out the military presence of France. What we support on side government is that it's much better for France to start a tactical withdrawal and a continued exit from West Africa rather than being forced out of West African nations violently and relations being further broken down. First point of setup, what is French West Africa? These are countries that were colonized by France in the past, including 8 nations of Senegal, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, Niger, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, and Benin. Second point of setup, what is the status quo of West African states? France's decolonization process was quite unique. It didn't decolonize and give these states independence, but it coerced these states to remain in a program called state services through threats and political assassinations. There are 2 problems caused by this. The first is stability and security. It looks like rising threats from Islamist insurgency and political instability, both of which were caused by anti-French sentiments. It also looks like economic problems that comes from the exploitation rooted in neocolonialism, which looks like French companies owning almost all of the natural resources in these West African states. Third point of setup. What does France's exit from West Africa look like? This exit includes the political, military, and economic exit from West Africa, which includes the forced exits that have already happened, but we also support the proactive efforts that are ongoing to exit West Africa. 3 notes on the exit. Firstly, France can still pursue any other forms of relations that are based on equal national sovereignty and international law. For example, it can still provide preferential trade agreements that all EU states give to their past colonial states. Secondly, some of the exits have already happened, like in Mali and Niger. Some of the exits are ongoing. We want to support both sorts of exits. And thirdly, this exit doesn't happen all at once, but it needs to start now to avoid further harms to African states. The burdens of proof then. Firstly, why France's exit fulfills the French obligation to decolonize through upholding sovereignty and supporting self-determination. Secondly, why France's exit improves the economic and political landscape within West Africa. On the split, I'll talk about the principle of why we fulfill the principal obligation to decolonize by upholding sovereignty and self-determination. My second speaker will talk about increased African cooperation. Before I move on to my argument, sure.
Why has the death toll from militant jihadism more than doubled since the Wagner Group became Mali's security partner in 2021?
We reject the premise that French exit has caused these harms. The reason why these jihadists are in power and the reason why these juntas are in power is because of the decades past of French staying in these countries, which led to anti-French sentiments that caused these jihadists and caused these juntas to rise into power in the first place. What you support then is the increase in anti-French sentiment, which will cause the other 5 of the 8 to have the same problems that exist in terms of jihadists and juntas. On to the first argument then, about why France's exit fulfilled the principal obligation of national sovereignty and self-determination. Firstly, why is sovereignty and self-determination the most important principle to maintain in international relations? In the past, through colonialism, and in the present, through neocolonialism, the right of these nations to self-determine is violated. This is the principle of international governments. These people have the right to decide who looks after them and how they are looked after, and this is infringed when France controls these nations. But secondly, in both the colonial past and in the present, the people of these states have had practically no say in how their country is governed. And this is problematic because it infringes on the rights of the core of democracy and freedom, which Western states support. Why then does France infringe on the national sovereignty of West African states in 3 key metrics? Firstly, let's talk about military control. France has permanent military bases across West African states. It's a looming threat for any West African state that wants to distance itself from France. But also, French control over the region's finances means that it impacts the military and security spending of these states, which reduces these states' ability to conduct warfare. There's both a principle and practical harm to this. On the principle, these West African states never consented to these agreements. They were coerced into these defense and military agreements. But practically, these countries cannot hire any other form of military support because it would seem to anger the French, even if hiring these other forms of military support would benefit them. What then does the military exit look like on our side of the house? It looks like the withdrawal of French troops currently stationed in West African countries. Some examples of this is the exit in Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso, which we think is somewhat regrettable because the increase in anti-French sentiment resulted in coups that forced the French military powers out. What we think then is a planned French exit in the other of these countries would allow for a much smoother transition of power. Instead of an imposition of French military support, the countries of these countries are free to choose the version of military support that best suits the needs of their own countries. For example, sovereign troops for their own countries, military support and alliances from regional blocs like ECOWAS and G5, but also government-hired PMCs. Instead of the ineffective Operation Barkhane, these states are then free to choose a form of military support they need, for example, foreign actors. Why then are foreign actors comparatively better than France? Assuming all foreign actors act in their self-interest, foreign actors like Turkey, India, Russia, and China are likely to be better actors than France for 3 separate reasons. The first is because partnerships are based on political consent and equal sovereignty. The reason why these military support will be there is not because France imposed it upon these West African states, but because these West African states chose these military powers, which gives them more negotiating power because they get to choose from different powers. Secondly, local people are more open to working with these powers. The reason why French military intervention in these states was so unproductive is because locals and local groups actively resisted French in these areas. But thirdly, these military groups are just more effective in terms of security and defense. PMCs are historically much better at fighting against insurgencies in West African states. China historically has a very good track record of preventing piracy in maritime trade routes. The biggest example of this is Russia's Expeditionary Corps, which were able to take down insurgent groups in Mali when France couldn't even stop them from going. So in terms of military control, we better allow these states to have sovereignty over controlling their own state. I'll take it.
Why is it likely that China will come in? You say it might be good, but you never say it's likely. It's empirically true that the Wagner Group will unstable control.
It's empirically true that China and Russia are in West Africa, and it's also true that they have incentives incentives to enter, the fact is that these incentives are much better and much more transparent because it's clear that you're trading some natural resources for some military protection as opposed to imposing France onto these countries without any form of choice from these countries. Secondly, then, on economic control. France controls the CFA franc, which is the currency used by all West African nations, which has allowed French companies to buy African resources without any transaction fees. France also holds veto power in the central bank of West African states. It's used this veto power to block Côte d'Ivoire from being refinanced by the bank when it wanted to distance itself from France. French companies also own a large majority of the natural resource deposits in these West African states. This disproportionate control then over West African economies infringes heavily on the national sovereignty of these countries. The reason why is because economic decisions are now not within the control of these countries. It infringes on the basic rights of the local population, and any economic benefits don't get to the people on the ground. The economic exit on our side of the house looks like then the removal of the CFA franc with another currency called the ECO, which is already in progress, the removal of France from positions of power in West African economies like the veto power it has in the central bank, and French companies selling off their natural resource deposits to their actual owners, which are these states and which are these local businesses. When France leaves then, it no longer has disproportionate control over West African economies. It frees these states from economic colonialism and gives them the right to self-determination. These two lines of analysis, military and economic, prove why national sovereignty is infringed in the status quo and better protected in our world. And insofar as we prove that France is infringing on the national sovereignty and self-determination of these nations, we prove why France has the obligation to leave. I'm so proud to propose.
I thank the first proposition speaker for opening the debate, and now to open the debate for the opposition, I would like to invite the first opposition speaker to present their speech. Here.
Am I at an okay volume for you? All good? Yep.
Maybe a bit more.
Louder? Yeah. France depletes less resources and stops more conflict, proud to oppose. 3 things in the speech, firstly on setup, secondly on the principle of sovereignty, and thirdly on West Africa. First, starting with setup, what do we stand for on our side? It means that France doesn't cut diplomatic ties with the military junta. Instead, they recognize the government somewhat, and they somewhat attempt to do things like cooperate with them. This is likely because Chad and Gabon haven't removed France from after the military coups because it was in their interest to keep France there. We would just simply argue it was also in the interest of these other governments as well. It's possible that France provides some economic concessions. They've already reformed the CFA franc. We think that if France just doesn't generally get kicked out economically. However, note that not all countries in West Africa are dictatorships. Senegal and Mauritania are also still democracies. We can say they can have democratic relationships with France. So why is the comparative here that the Wagner Group steps in on side affirmative? Note they provide you a sea of alternatives and never prove one, never give you examples of where it's true. We'd say that the Wagner Group is most likely for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's empirically true that the Wagner Group is working with Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, but this is not an accident. Many of these countries are fighting militant jihadism within the region and require some level of security partner, so they prioritize the Russian private military security partner. And secondly, Wagner is the only place that fits lots of their criteria, being a non-Western hegemon colonizer, being interested in Western Africa militarily and economically. Russia wants resources so bad because of the war. They have the capacity to do stuff like put boots on the ground in West Africa. They have put boots on the ground in West Africa. Has China? No, they have not. They cannot prove that is likely. But note the alternatives they provide of maybe the China, maybe US, maybe a sea of one that they never even pick to. Don't let them run away by never picking or proving a comparative. It just won't be likely because first, these countries are very isolationist. China is scaling back things like the Belt and Road Initiative. US is becoming more isolationist. And secondly, often just not empirically true. They can't get away with that. So noting that we have the likely comparative, we will go ahead. I'll take your point now.
Do you support France ever leaving West Africa? And if you do, who decides when France leaves?
We think that people should democratically decide at some point whether they want to have relationships with other countries. Maybe hundreds of years in the future, it might be a good idea. Let's just have the debate here rather than having speculative debates about things we don't know about. So, next thing on to the principle of sovereignty. 3 ways that we get up on this. Firstly, not all countries want France out. Chad, the Ivory Coast, and Senegal want to keep France in there, and when France does leave and do exit, they don't get that represented in what they want. They no longer get those relationships with France. They lose their sovereign decision there. Secondly, lots of the countries they point to have become dictatorships in the absence of France. They've enforced kicking out France even when it does not reflect the will of the people by using propaganda and force to silence dissidents that agree with keeping France because it is good for them economically. And also, there are people living in dictatorships cannot affect their government, so that we don't care about sovereignty because it means states get sovereignty. It's because people get their democratic will reflected. When democracies have crumbled after France has fallen out, that means that sovereignty no longer matters because people do not get to affect their own government. Third reason is that Wagner is just far, far more coercive than France is. The countries in West Africa have far less power than they did when France was there. And note, you may not believe that. That's in the practical argument. This principle of sovereignty is practically contingent on proving that they do are less coercive. So, that said, let's go into the practical argument. Why is this better for West Africa? 4 reasons. The first reason is France is just far, far more accountable than Wagner Group is, or China, whatever comparative they want to give you. Why is it true that France is more accountable? Firstly, France is currently facing backlash on reaping the benefits of colonialism through international organizations like the EU. The Italian leader Giorgia Meloni is doing a lot of backlash against France for reaping benefits of colonialism. Obviously, places like the Wagner Group in Russia do not face the same extent of backlash politically from international organizations. Even if China is the comparative, they don't face that extent of backlash because they're more separated from the political world. Second sub-reason that they're more accountable is they have more domestic political backlash. Because France has a population that cares about human rights. They have a strong African minority population that can do backlash if they do bad things in West Africa and entirely stuff it up. Though the comparative here is autocracies, not even democracies. Even if you did believe that there were African people in China, they could not vote in those cases. They were unable to get that benefit. But third part is the existence of France in these countries means there's more free media, which is able to hold you accountable and hold these governments accountable. The free media does not exist when a PMC of the Wagner Group comes in there. Free media doesn't exist when the China comparative comes in there. That's it. So what are the impacts of this accountability? Firstly, elections are run more fairly and do not cement the ruling party so that you can get good deals for Russia and favour them. Secondly, you're able to drain far less resources as the external power of France from there, whereas Russia is able to drain resources to fund its war. And thirdly, you're less likely to take brutal methods to enforce stability, like the Wagner Group would execute an entire village to kill 2 jihadists, because it didn't matter that they killed a bunch of civilians in the context, because they were not accountable to doing that. They would do it in the quickest way possible. That explains far more accountable on our side. West Africa would be better off with France. Second reason that West Africa is better off with France is that France has more capacity to be able to do good things for them. Why is it true that France has more capacity? Firstly, France just has far more money and isn't currently actively fighting a conflict. The Wagner Group has far less money and is actually fighting a conflict in Russia. They have less capacity to spend time in West Africa and focus there. But secondly, they have specific resources to being a free and fair democracy, like free press and election officials that they can implement here that Wagner Group does not. The impacts of this are first on democracy. France is able to uniquely bring in news outlets and election experts that ensure free press and free elections. On the economy, France has the capacity to invest in building up the infrastructure, which massively improves the quality of lives for these people, doing things like improving transportation networks, improving port systems, so that they can help them overall. And also, on stability, France has special ops able to limit the number of civilian casualties rather than summarily executing an entire village. They have enough and good enough troops to ensure stability. Note that the Wagner Group is actually fighting conflict in Russia. That's where their best troops are going. Their worst troops are going here, which means they have less capacity to do good things. But note at the end of this, you didn't even have to believe that France had a good incentive, didn't have to believe that we were doing this well. You just had to believe that having more troops was a deterrent. The fact that France was a big military power meant you wouldn't start a conflict in the first place. Didn't have to believe that we'd intervene well, just that meant that you didn't do separatist states, you didn't do coups because you were scared that France would be able to have the capacity to intervene in a way that the Wagner Group would not, and that they have had many uprisings and coups in separatist states on their side. Third reason that the France is better off is that they just have an incentive to do better things. Even if you think they intervene the same amount, and because they don't deter, they have a better incentive. Why is this true? 3 reasons. Firstly, they probably care about healing and repairing the colonial damage that they did. They're not an entirely evil country. The Wagner Group, literally is kind of entirely evil, right? The comparative here, maybe France, you don't think that they're, politically great, but they're not evil. The Wagner Group literally is. Secondly, the Wagner has strong negative incentives because they need to exploit resources. They will lose the war if they don't get the oil, the lithium, and the uranium they need for their military systems, for their energy systems. Maybe both countries have economic incentives to somewhat take resources out of West Africa. One is about making your country a little bit better. One is about stopping you from losing a war. Obviously, the one where you're stopping your country from losing a war war means that you're far more likely to exploit heavily on their side. But thirdly, France leaving, even if they don't do it well, just creates a power vacuum on their side. It means that there are a bunch of local actors trying to exploit West Africa, trying to get their own benefits out of it. At best, it is transitional harmless opposition. They never do the legwork to prove it's transitional. It's empirically still going. When is it going to stop? You guys need to tell us when the conflicts in West Africa will stop because France exited. The impacts of this is that democracy, it means remaining democracies in West Africa remain there, and the Wagner Group doesn't actively prop up military governments to serve Russia. It means that France uniquely has an incentive for stability of the whole region, not just protecting the mining sector, whether they can exploit resources from. They want to protect everyone, and a West African economy that serves themselves. Lastly, is that France, you get more negotiating, last mechanism, so you get more negotiating power when you make deals with France than you did in the Wagner Group. Nearly all the material about coercion does not stand off this mechanism, because these countries right now in West Africa are facing existential crisis that they point to, which means they're in a uniquely bad negotiating position after the exit of France from West Africa. So they end up making bad deals with Wagner. When France went in the 1950s during an era of decolonization, it was not politically as much acceptable than to do the exploitation that's happening. These states had far more negotiating power, meant they're far better off. This means that African countries are less likely to prop up dictatorial regimes and trade off. We win on democracy, economy, stability in West Africa from this. Very, very proud to oppose.
Speech, and now to continue the debate for the proposition, I would like to invite the second proposition speaker to deliver their speech. Here.
Former French colonies in West Africa were declared independent in 1959, but autonomy is merely a facade. The French troops have been given decades and decades to prove their worth, and yet all they have done in French interference is continue to hinder these countries economically, cause political turmoil, and prevent true Pan-Africanism. It is time that the French leave. Two things I'll do in my speech. First, I'll discuss three issues in the first exchange, and second, I'll forward substantive material on the unique empowerment of African nations. Firstly, I'd just like to deal with the alternative of other actors who come in, because note that the crux of their positive material is on the fact that the Wagner Group is the only alternative under our side. I would tell you that this is untrue, and a lot of their case is contingent on this. The incentives exist for other actors to come in as well, panel, because South Africa is still West Africa is still a resource-rich nation, a region with some things to offer in terms of trading as a trading partner. That is under their very own analysis on how countries are going to come exploit these nations, meaning that these nations in the first place have things to offer. We told you, though, that this is just empirically true, because China is already expanding its Belt and Road Initiative to West Africa. Russia is already coming in, and Turkey and India are also investing in tech and IT industries within these countries. And so don't let them get away with the framing that the Wagner Group is necessarily the only alternative when you already have India and Guinea and Nigeria, when we already have Turkey and Niger as well. But secondly, on the principle of sovereignty, because they told you that the alternative of diplomatic and and equal relations is not possible. The alternative of the equal relations with countries such as China or countries like Wagner Group is not possible. Yet under their side, they say that they're going to try to claim a more equal relation with France, where France somehow gives power and sovereignty to these nations. We told you that this is very untrue because of their very own characterizations panel. Because these nations have historically depended on France, meaning that if you continue these same sort of relationships without necessarily giving France an ultimatum, France has no incentive to give you more power because they know that without them, for example, you may hurt in certain ways if there are not other actors. And so equitable deals don't exist under their side. If they wanted democratic choice occurs more under our side, when there are more options to choose from, when these countries such as China, India, and Turkey all want something from West African nations, and West African nations are the ones who can, for example, have negotiating power, meaning that they can negotiate for more favorable terms of trade. And also, let us note that under our comparative, countries in West Africa, if they choose to do so, can still interact with France on an economic or trade level. It's just that France is not physically within their country imposing their laws on them. This means that if you really depended on France as a partner of trade, you could still do so, but this is under your own terms. It is not under the imposition of colonialism. But their principal argument comes under this framing that not all countries want France out, and somehow countries become worse dictatorships in the absence of France. Note that a lot of their problems that they give you have been caused as a result of France in the first place. Things like military juntas would not have risen up if France did not fail to adequately provide these citizens with the resources, with the development that they needed. France was the actor that needed to go. But this ignores a lot of my first speaker's argument on that we already told you, that these countries were ones that wanted France out, that this is why 3 out of the 8 nations have already forced France to leave on a military scale, because the incentive of these nations is now one of call-outs, right? Is now one where they wanted to be sovereign. It's now one where they wanted to control their democracy, or wanted to control their nations economically. And this was the only way they could do so. Don't let them get away with the principle of France somehow giving these countries sovereignty when they haven't done so for 6 decades. Sure.
Do you think military dictators like Saddam Hussein would represent the will of the Iraqi people?
I think that what is worse is that France, at least under their side, was never supported by the popular will of the people. At least military dictators at some point garnered some support in order to be able to rise up. Comparatively, we know that this is not the best case, but it is better than one where people have no say at all. Second issue on insurgencies and violence. Firstly, I reject the premise that the high death toll is mutually exclusive. On both sides, civilians had to die. The difference is that under our side, when you have countries like China who actively train the military, who actively are coming in to fund the national military, you actually have decreased insurgency. You actually solve the problems created by France. What happens under their side is worse, and I'm going to flip this, because in the future, at least when France leaves, you de-escalate the conflicts that were started from France in the first place. When you have less polarization, when you have less ability for these like extremist insurgent groups to capitalize off of people's anti-French rhetoric, that is when you get less of these insurgencies in the first place. You have less of the rhetoric in the first place, which means that in the first place you don't have the insurgencies that you have to deal with. Even if in the worst case we trade off the deaths right now that are marginally higher, we think this is a worth it trade-off for the long run, where you don't have as many of the uprisings that occur under their side and the violence that occurs. But third, on the development of West Africa, I think it's very ironic that they say that the French can be held accountable, because if the French truly could be held accountable, they would have been gone 60 years ago, at the point where they could not develop West Africa, at the point where West African nations continue to be historically and in the modern day still the slowest growing countries in Africa or in the region. But they say that France has more capacity, to fight with other conflicts. I think this is simply untrue looking at the facts, where Operation Barkhane was a huge failure just because the French were very reactive, because they didn't want to put in their resources, because they had no incentive to actually save you before the problems occurred, because they were only willing to do so after the fact, when it started to affect their economy, or when it started to affect the actual benefits that they reaped as a country. I think France, in the first place, is much worse under their side. West Africa is better off, though, on a flip, under our world, in terms of development. This is because of the very stability that they want to talk about. Stability is a code word for stagnation panel, because under their world, what France refuses to do is actually allow these economies to develop, is actually allow the development or creation of new infrastructure. What you do when you peg the, for example, CFA franc to a very, very, to the euro, is you essentially force these West African nations to develop European policies. This stagnates them because European policies, which are focused on low inflation rates, are focused on things like stability. This has historically hurt weak nations such as Greece before. It continues to hurt West African nations who are developing nations who cannot live under stability. What they need is growth, and that growth only occurs when a shift in regime is actually occurring. It is not caused by stability. But now I'm going to move on to my substantive then on how France's exit uniquely fosters African cooperation. At the top of this argument, I'd just like to characterize that the degree of interference that France imposes on their previous colonies is unmatched by any other previous colonial power. But France's exit uniquely promotes cooperation because French direct interference undermines Pan-Africanism. In the past, the influence of the French on aspects of controlling West African nations directly clashed against these ideals of removing the white man's power and becoming empowered. And even in the present, even when France has lost control, states are still divided. This is reflected in polarized discussions around keeping or changing the economy from using the currency of the franc. To move towards collective collaboration for African nations, this is much better to dissociate from the French imposition completely for two reasons. One, the removal of a symbol of past extremism shows the willingness of a country to move forward to a different future, but two, you're likely to have more political and economic compromises when countries actually accept each other as legitimate African nations and not as extensions of French imperialism as a whole. The impact of this argument is very clear. We have countries that work together more. We have countries working together towards very important developmental improvements, like Agenda 2063, which aims to improve economic integration, like African Continental Free Trade Area, which aims to boost the trade and unify the continent. This is an exclusive benefit we bring on side government, so proud to propose.
I thank the second proposition speaker for their kind speech. This will give panel 10 seconds to finish their remarks. Okay, thank you for your patience. And now to continue the debate for the opposition, I would like to invite the second opposition speaker to deliver their speech. Here.
Thailand operates in an imaginary world where France's exit somehow catalyzes a multitude of countries coming in to replace it. And their generic analysis is, oh, countries want resources. Our question is, if countries want resources from West Africa, why doesn't Australia come in? Why doesn't Thailand come into these countries? Obviously, that was an unrealistic comparative. Look at the real world. In Mali, after the coup, Wagner was invited into these countries, and they offered their security forces in exchange for exorbitant concessions in their minds. Look at the real world. I asked this team to name one country where an alternative military group has come into West Africa. Obviously, the comparative wasn't China's military comes in, but even if you don't believe that, we gave you structural reasons as to why that wasn't the case. Firstly, Wagner was most incentivized because they had a war to fight, they cared about resources. Secondly, China and India would never commit troops on the ground because they were increasingly isolationist. China had never been in a standing war since 1978 after they failed miserably in Vietnam. They would never be willing to do that. But thirdly, even on an economic level, China was scaling back its BRI because they were economically struggling, because they cared more about domestic circulation than its international sphere. And the strategic implication is quite devastating for this case, right? Because firstly, their principle just utterly fails. These countries do not have an alternative other than Wagner. They have to choose Wagner. Therefore, all matters of sovereignty go out of the debate. Secondly, it means that their economic arguments also don't work because West Africa can't just pick the best deal. They have to accept the deal that's given by Wagner. But we're willing to be charitable. We're willing to win this debate, even when the alternative is China. We can do that. I'm going to do 4 things in this speech. Firstly, on the principles. Secondly, on stability. Thirdly, on the political and economic impacts on Western Africa. Then, lastly, a substantive portion why it's bad for the world. No. First way we win this debate is on their own metric of the principle of sovereignty, because they say, oh, we need to fulfill France's obligation to leave West Africa, and stuff like that. A couple of things to note here. Firstly, it's unclear that France's presence violates sovereignty because France has increasingly made concessions to not be so seen as neo-colonial. They've made substantial changes because of international scrutiny. This looks like, for example, reforms to the CFA franc that they referenced in their own speech. This is something we can claim under our side as well. But also, the fact that these countries wanted France to come back. Mali literally invited France to come in to help with the jihadism, right? But also, a world in which France does not exit presumably means that France makes concessions to these countries. It shows a willingness to cooperate with them and treat them as a security partner, not as a colonial, right? Secondly, it's unclear that military dictatorships who wanted France out represented the true will of the people. We think that coup makers often had very dubious popular support because they jailed dissidents, because they jailed political leaders who opposed them. This was not a functional democracy that this team operated under. It was a dictatorship. It is unclear that this sovereignty, that the dictatorship's preference is the reflection of the people. We think that this argument isn't the average person in this country wanting a colonial power out. It's rather a military dictatorship wanting any sort of Western accountability that can hold their cruelty and their atrocity in account, wanting the France out. We think that is unclear. But thirdly, it's unclear that Proc discharges this principle. Obviously, it is practically contingent on whether the comparative, as I alluded to in my introduction, can also ensure self-determination and sovereignty. Obviously, it is contingent on them proving that the alternative is not much worse. They said that, alternative countries are better because Western Africa can choose who comes in. But this is obviously not true. Firstly, empirically, Wagner is in these countries most of the cases. But secondly, Wu explains that why other countries are not the case. But we also flip this, right? Because Wu explains in his own speech why the negotiating power of West African countries in this current context is far less than what it was in the 1950s when French companies came in. Because these countries are now facing existential crisis and existential threats from jihadism, they are now in a much more desperate state in which they are willing to take whatever Wagner offers them because they are literally under existential threat, right? In our comparative, when French companies and French forces came in the 1950s in the decolonization era, they were not under existential threat by jihadists. So obviously they had far more negotiating power in our world in the 1950s. So obviously they could negotiate far more favorable terms. That is why comparatively we are far better at discharging this principle. If they want to win this debate on principle grounds, they need to do some practical analysis. They can't just keep relying on their principle crush. But note our charitability in engaging with their main win path. At the end of this, we've basically mitigated it down to nothing. We've flipped it in many contexts, as Wu alluded to in his own speech, and we've shown you that it is clearly practically contingent. But this wasn't really what the debate was about, right? We won for a second time over when we proved that France's presence was crucial for West African stability in 2 ways. Firstly, France deterred the eruption of ethnic and separatist conflicts. It deterred many coups from happening. Secondly, it was far better at fighting jihadism than any other actor. What did they say? They firstly said that Operation Barkhane didn't work and that PMCs are better at fighting insurgencies. Firstly, France was very good at fighting insurgencies in Operation Barkhane. They shared information and logistics, such as in Niger. They recaptured several cities in Operation Savelle, such as Gao, from jihadists. Barkhane was a relative success. But also, we think that jihadism was just a problem that neither team could solve in this debate. Jihadism was a problem that arose from structural reasons like inequality, etc. Wagner couldn't solve jihadism on their side, but maybe France couldn't eliminate jihadism entirely, but they've done the best job that we've seen so far because they contained jihadism reasonably well, because they've stopped jihadists from overrunning major cities. Wagner has done a terrible job. Local governments have been incompetent in 3 distinct ways. Firstly, because Wagner is just actively evil and doesn't care about human rights. In Mora, for example, Wagner literally tortured and killed 500 civilians, all from an ethnic minority group. Tactics are blunt and horrifying. It looks like scorching entire villages suspected of hiding jihadists. This isn't effective counter-terrorism strategies. These are brutal and cruel human atrocities that Wagner is carrying out. This actively worsens jihadism because it radicalizes members of the jihadist group and the local population, because the tactics that Wagner uses are so blunt and indiscriminate that it radicalizes more people than anti-French sentiment. But also because Russia is stretched thin in the Ukraine war, because it's lacking equipment, which means that they often give the worst equipment to these countries. They often just give like cluster bombs that are like Soviet-era style cluster bombs, which means that these countries have no choice but to carpet bomb entire villages to fight jihadists. But also because local governments are often too poor and often too divided by ethnic conflicts to fight jihadism. But in your response, we think that France has a unique incentive other than Wagner to protect regional stability in West Africa, for the reason that France is very close to West Africa, so the problems that in West Africa have a very high chance of spilling over into France. For example, building resentment or insurgency or terrorism makes it likely that those terrorists also attack France. We've seen this in the past. 82 terrorist attacks have been committed in France in the past few decades. Comparatively, so this gives them a very clear incentive to preserve regional stability, to decrease the amount of terrorism in the area. Comparatively, China and Russia are far, far, far away, which means that they don't have as far of a big incentive to combat jihadism. Their best claim was that, the increased anti-French sentiment was what led to juntas and jihadists radicalizing in the first place. 3 responses to this. Firstly, this isn't a retrospective debate. You guys can't regret France colonizing West Africa and this anti-French sentiment not existing in the first place. Obviously, anti-French sentiment exists on either side, so military juntas and jihadists are also radicalized. You guys can't rely on that. But secondly, the obvious response here is that juntas and military coup makers aren't motivated by anti-French sentiments. They're not anti-French driven movements. They're often ideological movements. They're often religious movements, which means that anti-French sentiment is not the crucial part of these movements. These movements still exist in isolation. But we flip this for 2 reasons. Firstly, because as I alluded to before, jihadism gets worse because the tactics that Wagner uses are far, far worse and far, far brutal for the civilian population. But secondly, because as Will pointed out, these juntas can consolidate power far easily when a non-Western state is in their country and a non-Western state allows them to do things like suppress the population and crack down on press freedom, right? If it was France, they wouldn't allow those juntas to do that, so therefore we don't have the juntas consolidating power in these regions. What is the impact in weighing here? This wasn't some abstract benefit of regional security. This was the most concrete and legitimate impact in this round. It meant that innocent civilians didn't die in horrifying ways. It meant that jihadists didn't overrun cities and ethnic and separatist conflicts didn't raise their villages to the crown. Why does this outweigh the principle? 3 pieces of weighing. Firstly, because stability is a logically precondition to literally everything else in this round. Economics, stability, everything. People needed to be alive in order to access any of their self-determination or sovereignty benefits. Like countries and economies needed to know that the region was stable in order to invest in these reasons. For those reasons, we think that stability is an obvious win for our side that wins this debate. For those reasons, I oppose.
I thank the second opposition speaker for their speech, and now we have the debate for the proposition. I would like to invite the third proposition speaker to deliver their speech. Here it is.
Don't let side opposition fool you.
France is committing neo-colonialism and literally influencing all aspects of the country. I don't understand their very, very imperialist language. They seem to me like, oh, countries in the developing world cannot make decisions, and because sometimes it's quite good for us to have Western states in there, that means that we should have it all the time. On our side, we say that sovereignty was most important. They are very, very imperialist, very, very proud to propose. Two clashes then in my speech. Firstly, on the principle on sovereignty and democracy, and secondly, on the development of the region. The first one on the principle on sovereignty and democracy. First question I want to ask, how much influence does France have on this region? Because the degree of influence is literally unmatched, unengaged with by their side. They say that one, they're trying to heal colonial damage and they're not really doing a bad thing. The first question that I want to question them is that if they were so really, really nice actors, why didn't they fund them from afar? Why didn't they go into these countries and impose CFA franc, impose the ability for them to take control of all the mine, no thank you, and thirdly, take control of their military to make sure that who gets into power and fund pro-French leaders. At the end of the day, they're not here to be nice, panel. If they were so nice, why are they still the most poor countries in the world? Because they still did not accept that the majority of problems that happen in West Africa is literally caused by France. It is sufficiently important here that no thank you, that if France had good incentives, they would never be here in the first place. They can talk about international scrutiny and freedom of press in all instances, but they never prove to me why this actually happens. Because at the end of the day, because France is already in that country, when they exploit those resources, why do they have incentive for media scrutiny? We don't understand how UN would come in and check and balance on them, no thank you, because at the end of the day, France already puts large control over those areas and makes sure that other individuals cannot come in. That means, and secondly, I have a really, really big problem with their imperialist language, because they say that sometimes sovereignty is not important because they might turn to a dictator and they might make bad decisions. The first thing, not all dictatorial countries are the same as Saddam Hussein, which they talk about, no thank you. That means then that dictatorial countries can also be, for instance, should not be subjected to neo-colonialism, because for instance, under those countries, when they make bad decisions, there are still things, for example, checks and balance and coups that can come up. But the important thing here is that at the end of the day, it is about state legitimacy and making bad decisions. Because making bad decisions would exist under both sides of the house, no thank you, but only under our side do those bad decisions are much, much better. Because the bad decision on their side is literally blame on the colonial masters that screws up French sentiments and makes sure that under their side of the house, the colonial masters make much worse regional stability. Under our side, maybe some instances, no thank you, there are bad decisions, but at the end of the day, it's about sovereignty, that people are seen as a legitimate state and they take them accountable and make sure that the representation of the people was there. Secondly then, they cannot just say that all countries in here are dictatorial, because they say simply under their side of the house of democracies as well. So under those democracies, why are French still imposing all of their narratives no thank you under these countries? It is for them now to make decisions from their own, and this is the most important impact in this round. Why was this truly sufficient for us to win then? Number one, we explore the choice in which I'll talk about. That's why we get much better choice on who you choose as your partner, and you get much better choices to how you want to protect your citizens. That's why you see in status quo, Mali, after French left, it allowed them to combat terrorism. No thank you. They talk about terrorism as if it's such a nice issue, right? Because they're literally kidnapping individuals, literally torturing communities to take territory. I think that it was fine for them to escalate warfare to make sure that their citizens are protected. Secondly then, principle on sovereignty makes sure that it was only under our side of the house that they weren't subjected to the same colonial masters, no thank you, that they were talking about. Colonialism is the worst form because you don't give them control and you don't allow them to develop. Secondly then, on democracy, I just want to note here that number one, in terms of democracy, on their side of the house, the countries that are already democratic is sufficiently important, no thank you. Because we told you since first speaker that the reason these countries turned non-democratic was because of the French. The fact that anti-French sentiments needed to come up to make sure that military coups kicked the French out and pressured the French to go out. That was the reason why dictatorial regimes only come on their side of the house, and the countries that are already still democratic is the most impactful in this round. They cannot say, oh, it's a regrets debate, but we still have 5 other countries that will be affected under their side of the house. But secondly, these things are reversible, right? Because at the end of the day, dictatorial regimes can transition at the end of the day. On our side of the house, when you prove that there's less anti-French sentiments, because you see in status quo, we are really, really happy with other countries coming in, no thank you. That means that under our side of the house, it's much more likely that we can transition to a democracy where people are not literally having military coups every single second. That's why in status quo, military coups are the most, and 72% are in Africa, and in that 10 to 28 coups, 72% are in Africa. That's mean why in democracy we get much better under our side because the French didn't represent the people and only represented their own interests. On our side then we get much better actors, no thank you, because one, we tell you that you can choose your own troops, you can choose G5 alliance forces, you can choose PMCs around the world. Turkey has already put their troops into Niger and Nigeria because of the same resources that we want to talk about under our side of the house. There was a much more choices and equal exchanges, and negotiation can only come on our side when you have competition from many actors to make sure that these states have sovereignty and these states make the best decision for our own West African nations. So by that metric then, on their side, they're very imperialist. They cannot win this round. No thank you. Oh, before I move on, sure, point.
In the absence of France, Russia is taking oil, lithium, and from the West African states to fund their recolonization of Ukraine. Ukraine is losing to its colonial power of Russia. Why is this justifiable?
Okay. The justifiable thing is that they traded normally. Every political trade and transactions would never be equal. But the point here is that they make concessions. For instance, they actually put in military troops that are effective. On their side of the house, those trades are ones in which are extremely neo-colonialist, in which literally come into the country and remove their sovereignty. Second clashing on the development of the region. I just want to note at the top on the regional stability of our side of the house. We told you on terrorism, the root cause is literally France. Because in that Sahel region, the region where it's muchly controlled by France, people needed to turn away from governments and turn to other support structures. For instance, anti-French sentiments that started this terrorist group in the first place to make sure that they claim territory and make a state of their own. Operation Barkhane, no thank you, was largely unsuccessful because of their passive nature. Structural reason here was very simple. France was extremely reactionary and knew that under their side of the house, France would still take the benefits under the instance that terrorist groups are still there or not. This was sufficient then because they cannot talk about civilians because civilian deaths are likely to happen under both sides of the house. But it's important that only under our side, no thank you, that with the civilian deaths we also get effective terrorist combatants. Why? Because these states escalate warfare to make sure that these people proactively go into those regions, proactively make operations to make sure that the region is lacking of terrorism. We may not solve it in the best instance, but we make sure that it was only under our side that we did it well and make sure that they didn't expand anymore like they say on their side. This was also sufficient for us to win the round because that was the most important problem in West Africa right now. Secondly, on development, if they wanted resources, why can't they get in? Because France is literally owning the government, because France is controlling all of the resources. If you wanted to take control of the country right now, you need to make sure that you fight France and literally put France in an opposition. That's why there was so much lack of investment in status quo, and when France left Mali, when France left Niger, so many other actors are coming in to invest in those areas. For instance, Turkey, for instance, China, for instance, Russia. That's why, it's quite coincidental that when France left, it is now one of the most fastest growing economies inside of Africa. The reason for this is because it was only under our side of the house that we had investment and we had development of region in the instance where France didn't control of the government and control all of the resources. Don't let opposition fool you. France is not a great actor even though they come from the West. West countries also have really bad imperial incentives, and that's why side with government.
biggest problem for opposition in this debate was that they never proved what will happen on their comparative. They cannot just give you a bunch of speculative mechanism on why countries will come in and compete for resources when we gave you a bunch of structural analysis on why these countries will be forced to choose Russia. We didn't hear a response from opposition. They never analyzed why their comparative was likely. We gave you so many structural reasons why the USA and why China had active disincentive to come into this region. We already won on the comparative. Two issues in this debate. Firstly, before that, I'll quickly deal with our second speaker, substantive, on African cooperation, in case they want to whip it out of reply. First thing is just, this is not true. These African nations won't just start cooperating when, like, France leaves. The reason why there are conflicts are often because there are ethnic conflicts. Look at the many ethnic minority conflicts. For example, in Mali, between the majority race and the minority race, there are lots of, like, Fulani Muslims. In other countries, there are ethnic conflicts fueled by these regions. But also opposition massively exacerbates this conflict because the moment they had jihadism bleeding through the borders, because the borders were porous, because of poor Russian tactics in actually targeting these jihadist conflicts, these African nations are actively turned against each other. That was why their last path to victory never stood. So then, quickly on the principle, that the way they try to win this debate is on the principle. Note, that was just intrinsically problematic because firstly, we already proved that they never discharged their principle in the first place, that these countries weren't able to choose, and we have never heard a response from opposition. Couple of more things that they said, couple of more things they said at third. They just simply assert that France had unmatched control. That was just significantly untrue on their comparative when France has to leave and these countries are facing jihadist insurgencies. They were in a much more dire situation where they had to accept deals struck by Wagner. They had to give resource concessions because they had to deliver on their promises of keeping security safe. Exactly because of their rhetoric, or because of what they said at third, that these dictators no longer had the excuse to blame everything on France. That was the exact moment, or an additional reason, why they were likely to get unpreferable deals from militant groups, because now they had to bring these military groups in because they had to deliver their promises of opposition, if that was opposition's best case. Note that in this case, they already undermined their own principle because these people no longer had a choice. Not to mention, they also took away choices of democracies that wanted France to actively stay. They can't just support, we want France to exit from some Western African nations. They also had to support the exit from democracies that actively wanted France there. For example, Senegal. They never discharged that principle in the first place. But the most detrimental impact was when they tried to win on democracy. When they tried to say that countries wanted, because when they tried to say that, oh, they'll somehow get democracy in the long term, that was just structurally impossible. They never listened to our case because we already told you how, like, Wagner Group or China or any other PMCs had no incentive to keep democracies in this region. You actively evicted democracy. That was why you actively lost on the principle that you discharged. At the end of this, even if you believe that they won on their principle, why do we still weigh this out? Because we told you it was just logically downstream to stability. People had to be alive in order to assert their right to self-determination. We were the side that kept people from jihadist attacks. We were the side that kept people alive. We were very proud to defend that. So that was their own path to victory. They argued from first to third, and that was why they lost. So on our win path then, why do we get more stability? Firstly, let's talk about jihadist insurgency, because they tried to shift at third and try to say that we actually get more warfare. We told you on your side, you were actually the side that actually got more warfare because you were bringing other PMCs in. We told you these had, firstly, less trained troops because they Wagner Group literally pulled people from prison. They were less trained than the people from the French army. But also, we also were able to show you that these groups simply didn't have the investment into these regions. These groups simply didn't care about these regions enough, as we told you at third. That never got a response from them, and that was extremely detrimental. But the last response here is just to say that the France army was a much bigger deterrent for these countries because of the mere military presence there, because France had the extra incentive to preserve the security. The last push was trying to say that, oh, France was controlling these resources, therefore harming the stability of these regions. Firstly, this is just not true. Like, France mining companies are literally like paying taxes. I just don't think that this is true. But also, note that this is less true on our comparative, because for France's sake, they probably had to make some concessions. For example, pay mining taxes. That was just untrue on the comparative. That was not what we had to defend. But no, on their side, it was much worse because Wagner tried to take control of these resources in order to fund the war in Russia. That was such a worse impact on their side. Not to mention, we gave you a bunch of impact. If you still think this clash was a deadlock, we gave you a bunch of impact on coastal Western African nations, on how jihadism was now able to bleed through the border because of the brutal tactics that PMCs are likely to employ. These actively threatened the stability of this region, and that was why they actively lose on this issue, and that was why we won on this issue. Before I move on, yes.
Proactive specialized PMC to eliminate terrorist groups. Why is this conduction of warfare bad?
Because they are literally not professional. We told you firstly, they never had the incentive to put the best troops in West Africa. Listen to our case. But also, we told you that France was actually, like, fighting jihadism was actually just quite hard. We told you that these places never had intelligence infrastructure. We told you that France was probably doing its best. They were the side that had to provide mechanisms on why these troops were better. We had provided you a couple of structural examples of that, and first and second, and they never responded to that. The end result of this was that in our region, we got more stability. People didn't have to live their lives in fear, and that was just a good on the outside of the house. But lastly, let's give a couple of more responses on their economic argument, because they've been trying to say that monetary independence is good. A couple of responses. Firstly, we told you the most coercive elements, for example, the one they wanted to talk about, controlling currencies, we're going to replace anyways. For example, beginning in 2027, the ECOWAS countries will concluded the 8 CFA franc nation members are adopting the ECO, and they're also removing like 50% of the reserve requirement. So that was just an untrue argument to make on their side. They never got any economic benefits. But also, we just told you that the CFA franc was actually quite good because you were plagued to stable euros. It eliminates the chance of an uncontrolled inflationary spiral caused by currency collapse. We told you Congo's average rate of inflation was 50%. Zimbabwe suffered from hyperinflation. We never got that on our side. It meant that people could purchase goods and services on our side. But secondly, we told you the currency accepted by euro was just easier to access, easier to trade. That meant that we were able to build up countries' economic benefits. But lastly, if you remove the peg of the currency, the volatility still made it less attractive to foreign investment. That meant that they never got any of the infrastructure development that they claimed to get on their side. At the end of this, we won this debate 2 times over because we were able to show that firstly, people lived under stability, but also, secondly, we reaped all the economic benefits they tried to reap. Sovereignty was not a pathway to victory for them. They cannot stand for that. Thank you.
By the end of 3P, this proposition team staked their entire case on the principle. Firstly, we mitigated this principle down to literally nothing. Firstly, we told you that many countries like Senegal and Chad wanted France to stay in. If it was true that these countries probably wanted France to stay in and it was a self-determined choice there, then it probably evened out. But secondly, we told you that in the countries that wanted France out, these were all dictatorships, not democracies, dictatorships that didn't reflect the will of the people, dictatorships that saw France as a Western power that was holding their atrocities and their horrendous ethnic cleansing to account rather than a colonial power. So obviously, the will of the people wasn't represented in these democracies. But secondly, and this is a huge strategic blunder by this team, they never got over our analysis on the comparative, because we tell you structural reasons why Wagner is the most likely and empirical replacement for military security in these regions. We told you why, for example, China would never commit troops on the ground after they'd never been in a war since 1978. We told you why Turkey obviously would not commit troops on the ground. And crucially, every time we push them on the comparative, they switch the comparative. Firstly, they're like, China will come in. Then they're like, oh, Turkey will come in. Their switching of comparative means the strategic error of that means that they don't ever justify one single comparative, which means you should believe the comparative that we've analytically proven is the most likely, which is Wagner. And the strategic implication is quite devastating for this team, because the only military partner that these countries had was Russia. And the way Wagner actually structured these deals was in a way that if they had military control, they also had economic and political control, which defeats their economic points, right? Because it looked like, for example, Wagner being like, I'm going to give you security protection, in exchange, you're going to give me ownership over mines and resources. So it meant that other countries like China and Turkey couldn't come in when Wagner was the only security personnel in these countries. And also, we told you that it was clearly, therefore, practically contingent. So they had to prove why Wagner violated the sovereignty of these countries far, far less than what France did. And Will gave you 4 structural mechanisms at first as to why this wasn't the case, not responded to by this team. For those reasons, I think the principle is clearly out. But even if you didn't buy that, here are 2 weighing metrics as to why you shouldn't care about the principle, even if it does exist. Firstly, because notice the difference in our analytical rigor. Like, we've given you all those reasons. They keep asserting it's colonialist and imperialist, and they accuse us of being Western. They don't speak for West Africa. It's not imperialist to care about stability. It's not imperialist to care about democracy. I challenge this team to give us actual analytical reasons instead of accusing us of being Western or just asserting that it is imperialist. But secondly, and crucially, the principle can never get over our point on stability for 2 reasons. Firstly, because stability and regional peace was just upstream of many of their points, right? Because people didn't feel like they were sovereign and dignified beings at the point at which they were threatened by jihadism in the area, at the point at which Wagner literally killed 500 ethnic minorities because they were looking for jihadists in the area. That was not, upholding the principle of sovereignty. We thought that people needed to be alive to feel sovereign and feel dignified and feel free. They didn't allow people to do that. But also, secondly, stability was what people cared more about, right? It was coming home to your family every day that people cared more about, not some abstract principle of sovereignty that Thailand seemed to really want to push. So at the end of that, the principle clearly didn't matter, and even if you think it did, stability was far, far more important. The next thing I'm going to talk about is why we get far better outcomes for West Africa. Firstly, because we deterred conflicts and coups from happening in many contexts, and secondly, because we fought jihadists better. They just had 2 responses to this. Firstly, the key response is that, the root cause of jihadism and military coups is because of French colonialism. Firstly, not true. Jihadism was a religious thing, it wasn't an anti-French thing. Military coups were anti-democratic, not anti-French. But secondly, empirically, in the countries that France left, these military dictatorships still exist. Terrorists are still running rampant in Mali and Niger. It doesn't make sense for this team to be like, terrorism will disappear if France leaves. Obviously not empirically true, obviously ahistorical. But thirdly, we flip this in two key ways that they never responded to. Firstly, jihadism got worse because, as we told you down the bench, Wagner's tactics were far, far more brutal and far, far more devastating for the local population. And as any guerrilla tactician would know, if you literally crack down on the local population far more extensively, that radicalizes the population and turns them into jihadists. But secondly, because France was a democratic actor that cared about democracy, and Wagner actively wanted to keep these military dictatorships in place, they had no incentive to actually transition these juntas into democracies. For those reasons, proud to oppose.
Thank the opposition advice speaker for your speech. And now to conclude the candidate, I would like the proposition advice speaker to the next speech. Here.
China is already expanding Belt and Road Initiative to West Africa. India has already deployed its military into West African seas in 2023. It was not enough for Team Australia to conveniently only engage with the Wagner Group. 4 questions in this reply. First, on which actor is better? We told you that France's existence limits other countries' ability to show interest because of the prospect of fighting with France or proxy wars in the ability to show interest. Absent of France, you have more alternatives because West Africa is seen as a beneficial nation to trade with, like any other nation nation, it is more likely that when you have these alternatives, West Africa is given a choice. But regardless of actor, even if it is Wagner, we told you that regardless of this, at least the choice was given at some point in time. It is not the same as under their world, where France literally forced you to sign an agreement to stay with the state. Otherwise, your military and financial funds were taken away. This was a coercive decision under their world. France is disproportionately a worse actor when you take disproportionate controls of systems like economics, politics, and militaries. The incentives have existed for 60 years, panel, and nothing has ever been done. Don't let them fool you into thinking France is an angel. If they were truly good actors, they did not need to employ French adjacent dynasties in Senegal. They did not need to poison anti-French Cameroon leaders. The media scrutiny, they say, though, exists, takes a back burner in this debate. Because when people see that these issues are old news, or when these people see other issues that are more pressing in the current world, it is unlikely that active callouts happen. But even if callout happened, we tell you that they had no capacity to actually remove the French. Because of the inequitable relationships that have existed for decades and decades, we told you that the premise of this relationship was unfair in the first place. So no, they did not have more negotiating power because insurgent groups hadn't arisen yet, according to DLO. They did not have any power at all because they were forced by colonization. Second question, which side leads to more sovereignty? We told you absent of France, we allow for choice regardless of the choice. Trades with France can still occur if countries choose to, but this is done under their own terms. Their main pushback was how democracy is disrupted due to military juntas, right? But juntas are the result of decades of pent-up anti-French sentiments. Absent of this, absent of the French strategically leaving, what you have are that these groups continue to get larger and larger and rile more support. It gets worse under their side when the French do not actively leave right now or leave in the near future, which they conceded at first that if in the far future democracy wanted to elect the French to leave, they would be okay with that, right? But the problem is that by that time, you would have had so many more conflicts, you would have had so many more military people coming into power, gaining even more disproportionate control. But they say that if the country wanted to kick them out, they will. This is impossible given our characterization from first about the disproportionate power that France holds. It's like analogous to saying that sexual assault victims should have just said no. This is not true, panel. You have no ability to say no when you are in a coerced relationship. Third, on which side better deals with insurgency? Because here they have a very weird assertion that France has a strong military. We told you this is untrue. France has empirically failed to deal with insurgency. That's why Mali or Niger had to hire PMCs in the first place. But my whip told you that because of international law, France can only react to these things. They cannot preemptively improve or proactively act here. They told you that Wagner has bad incentives. First of all, even if we concede that Wagner Group is the group coming in, at least the symmetrical checks and balances exist under both sides if they want to claim that. But moreover, you have more good incentives when there are competition, when you can be threatened to be the power that they don't choose if you don't do a good job. That's why you have the incentive to employ your best troops. And in the long run, we just told you there are less conflicts in general just because of the fact that a lot of anti-French rhetoric is used to fuel other conflicts. Even if they are ethnic conflicts, the anti-French rhetoric is continually underpinning a lot of these things. But lastly, on which world leads to greater development of African nations, all their pushes were just untrue. France is not helpful to any developing country. It has not been helpful to the countries that have been poorest in Africa. In OPWIP, they tried to co-opt our mechanisms of economic unpegging, but note that this is done with the removal of France. This has been done because of the narrative that France needs to leave and French control needs to leave. Beyond this, we told you about African cooperation. This is unique because it allows countries to actually rise up against the forces of the West, against the unfairness of their treatment that has been imposed upon them for decades. So proud then to propose.